All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. This is part of the Unpacking Coaching webinar series that the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations hosts. I'm Mary Louise Hemmeter, and I'm going to be your host for today. Today's topic I'm very excited about is coaching conversations supporting teachers to implement pyramid model practices equitably. I want to just introduce my colleague and friend, Rosemary Allen. Y'all are in for a big treat today, and we're so lucky to have her. So, Rosemary, you want to do a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I am currently an associate professor at MSU Denver here in Colorado, focusing on early childhood. My primary focus is social justice, helping teachers, well, pre-service teachers, understand how issues of privilege, power, intersectionality, race, racism impact classroom strategies and teaching. And I'm also the president and CEO for the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence. And we actually license and monitor childcare facilities using a model I created called the Culturally Responsive Community-Based Licensing. We also provide professional development activities around equity, race, microaggressions, all of that. And we also have a parent advocacy arm where we work very closely with families to help them and assist them in responding to school issues. If their child has been suspended, we will also go with them to reentry meetings, help them respond to emails, and overall just provide support. So that's a little bit of what I do. And I'm also a consultant with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations.
Yes, and she does a whole lot more than that. But anyway, so we've kind of thought about two sets of practices that we want to focus on today. One is what does it look like when teachers are implementing culturally responsive practices in the classroom? And then the other set of practices or the other set of questions we want to ask are really about how can coaches support teachers to implement those practices. And I think we both have a goal today to be really practical, to help you move from we know this is an issue to what do we do about it. And so, really, what we want to focus on today is what do we do about it. So, I'm going to start with a kind of big two-part question, Rosemary, which is really about what does it look like when you walk in a room where teachers are implementing culturally responsive practices? And how's that different or the same as pyramid model practices? So we're here to talk about the pyramid model, and we want to be implementing culturally responsive practices. So what does that look like in a classroom?
Thank you so much, Mary Louise. I do want to start by saying that pyramid model practices are culturally responsive practices if you do it right and if you're very intentional. So when you walk into a classroom that's culturally responsive, that's using the pyramid model, that classroom, especially the environment, should scream, I designed this space with you in mind. Everything here was designed especially for you. So in a culturally responsive classroom, children should see themselves. They should be able to be themselves. And teachers are responding to the cultural and linguistic needs of the children in their care. So when you think about that, it's not so different from what we do. Because first, when you think about the foundation of our model is building those nurturing and supportive relationships. So every child in that classroom should be confident, should feel like they belong. They should feel like this is my space and I can be who I want to be in it. And they know that their teachers care about them. They want them to succeed and they count on teachers in times of need and support. And then the environment reflects who they are. So when you walk into a pyramid model classroom or a culturally responsive classroom, that's what you should see. Children who belong, who are safe and secure and playing and getting along with each other and being able to resolve their own conflicts and problems. And if they can't, the teacher is right there to assist without judgment.
Mhm.
You know, there are times we have conflicts in a classroom, and because of bias and everything else, teachers assume they know what happened.
Mhm.
And bias can live in that space when you're making assumptions. But in a culturally responsive classroom, we use those skills we've been taught so that we can neutralize those assumptions and
Mhm.
really, really promote the skills we want children to have.
So you often talk about daily acts of bias that go unnoticed in classrooms. What is that, and how do we help teachers attend to that in ways that address the bias?
And first, we really have to understand that we're all biased. Every single one of us. We didn't ask for it. We don't want it. It's like an inheritance that we'd like to give away, but we have it. So that's the first thing. The
Mhm.
second is we didn't create this. Because what I want for you more than anything is to develop a level of comfort that says I'm biased and I'm flawed. Because once we do that, we make room for growth. I was talking to a guy not long, Mary Louise, and he said, you know, I have never, ever, ever, ever in my life owned a slave. So I don't understand why we have to talk about this. I've never owned a slave. And I said, you know, that's awesome. That's interesting too. What's so interesting about it? I said, you know, it never occurred to me, but I've never, ever, ever in my whole life been a slave.
Mhm.
You've never owned one. I've never been one. But here we are,
Mhm.
standing here today, facing each other with the residual impacts of that horrible system in our hands. And now
Mhm.
we have a choice. We can correct it or we can let it continue to exist.
Mhm.
In our classrooms are bias. In our hearts are bias. In our environment, there's bias. In our society, there's bias. So we have to decide what we're going to do with that.
So
So
what might that look like in a classroom? Like what might those daily acts of bias that go unnoticed look like?
you know, one of the things that's so prevalent in almost every classroom I've been in is mispronouncing,
Mhm.
making fun of, shortening, and renaming children, their
Mhm.
names. So an act of bias is when a parent comes to you and says, these are my daughters, Patricia and Adriana. And you say, hi, Patricia, hey, Adriana.
Mhm.
Bias. That's not their names. There are names that, first I want to say every name is pronounceable.
Mhm.
Some take a little more effort than others. And it's okay to say, I may need help pronouncing your name. I was on a call yesterday and there was a person in the chat and I said, Paula. And I said, am I pronouncing your name right? And I said, please unmute and tell me. She
Mhm.
said, no, it's Paula.
Mhm.
And that vowel is not common in our language.
Mhm.
But every time I referred to her after that, I made the effort to say Paola. And
Mhm.
it makes a difference. So while it's not easy and it's not always comfortable, we have to pronounce children's names correctly. And secondly, we can't shorten people's names. When I say my name is Rosemarie, my name is Rosemarie. And you don't have permission to shorten my name and call me Rose, even if I'm 3 years old.
Mhm.
Your name is Mary Louise. I don't know if you would respond to Mary
Mhm.
or Lulu. You know, that's the other part. Not only shortening names, but then we rename people. I had a student named Sashiko, and the teacher said, that's just too hard to remember. I'm going to call you Sasha.
Mhm.
We can't rename people. So that's an act of bias. And one more thing, I just want to say this is making fun of children's names.
Mhm.
That's biased. I had a child named Hallelujah, and I saw two staff members making fun. Why did they name that baby Hallelujah? Why do people do that? That child's going to have a hard time when they grow up. See, I knew the story behind the name. I knew that her mother had given birth to two stillborns. Her last two babies were born dead. And when this child cried, she raised her hands in the bed and said, Hallelujah, and screamed, Hallelujah, for a very long time. How do we have the right to make fun of the name that was given? Her husband said, that is the baby's name.
Mhm.
So we don't have that right to make fun of children's names. And just one more thing, if I may, Mary Louise. You may find, especially African Americans, are very creative sometimes in naming their children. I want you to know the history of being denied the right not only to name your children, but to name yourself.
Mm,
When Africans were brought here, our names were taken away. The master gave us the names they wanted us to have and also named our children.
mm,
So for these young women having babies today, they're reclaiming the right to call their children what they want to call them. And usually there's a beautiful story behind it. So that's one act of bias. Another is assuming people with an accent is not intelligent.
mm,
You
mhm,
know, people who have accents, I heard teachers say, well, they can't read, they're illiterate. And I said, let's be specific. They can't read English because they don't speak English,
mhm,
but they're very literate in their home language. And active bias is fearing the neighborhood you work in.
mm,
I mean, some of you may go into areas that make you a little uncomfortable, but you cannot be effective in a neighborhood that you fear,
mhm,
because that neighborhood is comprised of the community. And that community is made up of the families. And in those families are the children you serve. So if you fear the community, the neighborhood, you fear the parents of the children, their relatives, their pastor, their barber, and all the people
mm,
contribute to that child's well being. An active bias in the classroom is calling on some children while ignoring others. It's weaponizing a child's name. How do we do that? Ashley.
mm,
Ashley, stop. Ashley, don't. Ashley, get over here. Oh my goodness, is it Ashley again? When we
mhm,
think about the pyramid model practice of having a supportive and nurturing relationship with a child, and the only time they hear their name is when you weaponize it in that negative way, that's not a nurturing relationship. That child will learn to hate to hear their name called from you. So
You
those are
know,
a few
that
examples.
makes me think, Rosemary, that sometimes I worry that we focus a lot on inappropriate use of harsh discipline and that we do that inequitably. We know that. But I also worry that maybe we're not implementing effective behavior support practices equitably, meaning what you just said about the only time we talk to Ashley is when we're upset with her, but she's never getting positive supportive practices. And could there be an equity issue there, meaning the same kids get the positive practices and the kids who don't are the kids who actually end up having harsh discipline, right? Versus thinking about how do we make sure every child is getting, like, if we do teapots, for those of y'all, most of y'all will know what a teapot is. It's a pyramid observation in a teacher's classroom. Teachers can get really high teapot scores, but they might not be doing those practices with half the kids in the classroom. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how do we make sure teachers are doing good practices, positive practices equitably in the classroom.
Thank you so much. Because first we have to be aware and we
Mhm,
have to accept the fact. And Mary Louise, we don't like to admit there are some children in our environments that rub us the wrong way.
mhm,
And as coaches, your responsibility is to help those you are supporting recognize that
mhm,
and to create a safe space where they can say it. I want to be able to say, I'm a Heather Tomlinson. I want to be able to say, Mary Louise, you're my coach. And while I care about all my children, I want them to succeed, as something about Heather that rubs me the wrong way.
mhm,
And once we can recognize those children for whatever reason, we don't have to get to the equity piece yet. We have to recognize there are some children in our environment that you don't respond as positively to.
mhm,
And once you do, and I do this with my students, I have them create check marks. So they'll have a sheet of paper with, say, 3 children's names at the top that they have difficulty connecting with. And every time they speak to them positively, they chart it. I
mm,
actually have them collect data.
mhm. I do that too. Mhm,
Yes, we believe we're treating every child the same, but when we begin to really look at our actions and who we're responding to, whose name is being called in a very loving, kind, supportive way, versus whose name is being called through correction. I mean,
Mhm.
it is frightening. It's frightening to see. I was called out years ago in my 20s. My observer, I had an observer, and she asked me if I like little girls. And I said, of course I like little girls. And she said, I can't tell because they sure get in a lot of trouble in your classroom, much more than the boys.
Mm,
That's all she said.
mhm,
But for coaches, I want you to know that worked. She
mhm,
didn't accuse me. She didn't make me feel bad. She just said, I can't tell because they
mm,
get in a lot more trouble than the boys. Oh, and she said, I wonder why.
mm.
But she made me wonder why. Because from that point on, I started noticing my interaction with little girls. And guess what? She was right.
Mhm.
I couldn't stand the little tattletale, some that little bossiness.
Mhm.
It was me, but her bringing it to my attention helped me recognize how I was reacting in a way I never would have before. So I think helping people to notice, bringing it up, helping them to collect data, and helping them to see. Sometimes it's a camera in a classroom
Mhm.
that you go back and look at later.
Mhm.
And you say, let's look at this, let's talk about it. I noticed that you really talked to Mary Louise a lot, but Victor hardly got any of your attention.
Mhm.
Why do you think that is? And just helping people to see it that
Yes, so I have a couple of thoughts about that. So one is that I wonder how we could get classroom teams to start checking each other. So if there's two adults in a classroom, can we check each other? Who are we spending time with? Those kind of things. But the other thing this made me think about as you were talking, so first you talked about not calling children by their names because you're uncomfortable with the name or whatever. It makes me think maybe that's why people aren't spending as much time with kids, right? So if I can't call you by name, am I less likely to go over and spend time with you? I just think it's a really interesting dynamic that might be increasing or decreasing the probability of adults working with children when they can't call them by their right name.
way. That's so fascinating, Mary Louise. It actually happened to me in a different way. I
Mhm.
was one of the only English speakers and the director of a childcare facility.
Mhm.
And so all of my children were from Mexico. I'd say 95% of them spoke Spanish,
Mhm.
and maybe 40% knew a little bit of English.
Mhm.
And the reason I use Adriana and Patricia as my examples, because it took me so long to learn how to say
Mm,
it.
mhm.
And it didn't stop me from interacting as much with the children, but it did in talking to the parents
Right, right.
because I was so afraid of mispronouncing their names that, and I wasn't as comfortable saying, Adriana had a good day today.
Mhm.
So because I wanted to avoid saying the child's name, I knew that I didn't give her as much feedback.
Yeah, yeah.
And that
It
may be happening with children too, like you said.
Mhm. So interesting. So I want to comment on one thing that's in the chat box, and then I'm going to ask a different question, which is someone is talking about the behavior incident reporting system as a way to uncover bias, which is a good way to look at for bias within programs. But it mostly looks at bias around inappropriate practices. And I want us to continue to think about this notion of, are we implementing appropriate practices in an equitable way? Because I think it's two sides of the same coin, but both really important. All right. So I have a question that I often get from teachers, and I'm wondering how you would respond to it. So I often have teachers say things like, I really don't have very diverse kids in my classroom. I mean, I live in the middle of X, and we really don't have much diversity in our classroom. So how do we do culturally responsive practices?
Culturally responsive practices are the practices that respond to the culture of the children in your room. So when you say we're not very diverse, which is very dangerous for us as early childhood people, because that means that we're not seeing every child and their uniqueness. We're saying everybody's exactly the same. What you're really saying is that all my children are white,
Mhm.
and we don't have any racial diversity. We have to stop, because even when all the children are white, or all the children are black, or all the children are Latinx, there's so much diversity. There's diversity amongst families. All of your children don't come from two-parent families. All of your children don't have the same income. All of your children don't share the same religion. And when you think about culture, culture is our way of being. All children don't do everything the same. I mean, all white children don't celebrate Christmas. And if they all celebrated Christmas, some customs are everybody wears the same pajamas at night on Christmas Eve and open their presents the next morning. Some customs are that we go to midnight mass and open our presents when we come back. Some is that we have tamales for dinner and not turkey and dressing. There's so much diversity, cultural diversity, that we sell ourselves short when we limit it to just the way children look. Do you know that all people who all look alike don't speak the same language with the same syntax? I was very shocked in my classroom. I don't know how it came up about how many generations you've been in Colorado.
Mhm.
And those of you who have heard me speak before, you know I'll give you the good, bad, and ugly, because I didn't show up as this culturally responsive expert, and I still have trouble with that term. But I was surprised, and this was maybe a year and a half ago, before COVID. The majority of my students were white. I had 3 Mexican girls. And when we talked about how long you've been here, 4 of my white students were first generation students.
Mm.
Shocked me. I mean, talk about thinking everybody's the same and look alike. They all were English language learners, those 4.
Mhm.
And 3 of my Latinx girls from Mexico had been here 4 generations or more.
Mm.
One, her family had been here before Colorado was Colorado, when it was Mexico, before the Mexican-American War. But it was so amazing, because had I looked at them, and you know how our society is, Americans are white people, they would have thought that my brand new students to this country were more American than my students who had been here for generations. Just powerful. So we can't make assumptions about culture based on how people look.
Yeah. It makes me think, both of us have some special ed in our background, training in our background. And, we've been trained to think about how do you individualize for children with disabilities. And all of this is really about individualizing for all children, right? What are children's rituals? What are children's customs? What are children's families? What are children's interests? What are all of that? If we thought about individualizing in that way, meaning knowing that about kids and knowing how to bring that into the classroom, that's really what we're talking about, right?
And that you have just defined culturally responsive practices. Have you ever been in a classroom and you had a child with an IEP and you thought every single child deserves this?
Exactly. Yes.
Every child deserves an individualized plan.
Mhm.
And that way, we're truly responding to their needs. And I
Mhm.
have to be honest with you, I have 2 children, almost 12 years apart. I thought my parenting style for my daughter would just work for my son.
Mm.
Did not.
Mhm.
There's so much I had to change to meet his needs. But as teachers, isn't that the same?
Yeah.
That we have to individualize our strategies to truly meet the needs of our children. I do want to expand this notion of culturally responsive, if
Mhm.
it's okay.
Mhm.
I want you, when you think about culturally responsive, that's the key term right now, but we have to expand it to also mean culturally sustaining, because so many children have to give up who they are when they come to our classrooms.
Mhm.
Believe it or not, there are still early childhood programs across the country that will not allow children to speak their home language,
Mm.
or make it so uncomfortable for them that they give it up, or children who don't bring in their cultural foods, or their cultural dress. So we want to sustain their culture by implementing that into our classroom. In the beginning, I said the classroom should scream, "This was created with me in mind."
Mm.
So children not only see themselves in the classroom, but other children see and understand. So when they speak a certain way or wear different clothing or have this kind of food or whatever, it's not odd and unusual. And then another component of being culturally responsive is promoting a positive racial identity development.
Mhm.
And some people say, well, what about white children? And it cracks me up because what you're saying is they don't have a culture.
Mhm.
We are cultural beings. We all have a culture. So when we promote the positive cultural and racial identity, then children again see themselves in your classroom.
Mhm.
That when a child wears an afro, that's another act of bias.
Mm.
Allowing children to touch the hair of Black children. I'm being very specific here. Anyone know the number one rule when it comes to Black hair? Put it in the chat box. Let me see. What is the number one rule when it comes to Black hair? Don't touch it. Don't touch it. I don't know the roots, but it is universal. And we're taught from little children. Every day I left school, my parents, be good, do what the teacher says, do your best, don't let nobody touch your hair. Just part of the rules.
Mhm.
So when you're in your classroom and children are touching Black children's hair and petting them, it's actually a precursor to suspension, believe it or not.
Mhm.
And when that child goes, no, don't touch my hair, they get in trouble for hitting or fighting. I've heard teachers say it's just hair. What's the big deal? Hair is a touch to bodies. Bodies should have boundaries. Consents cannot be learned too early. So, and I forgot my whole point I was going before I got on the hair. And
That's
Arlene said it's true for Pueblo people too. So it's true for some indigenous people. Thank you, Arlene, for that.
But it also makes me think, Rosemary, about how much do you see in the news these days about kids who wear dreadlocks to school get suspended, or if they don't cut their afro a certain length, they get suspended. I mean,
Mhm. Again, that's another daily act of bias.
mhm,
Why do we police the bodies of BIPOC children?
mhm,
And all we're doing is say, you have to look like me.
mhm,
You have to be acceptable to me. There's a TED talk, if you can put it in the chat box, Ashley, by William Anderson. Tattoos, afro sagging, what does that have to do with it? Something like that. And he talks about how that has nothing to do with learning. Nothing.
nothing.
But it's one way to control, to police, to say, for this short period of time, I own you.
Mhm, mhm.
And
I'm
actually,
in control.
I'm in control. And that has been true throughout history. I don't know if you know, even in the 1700s, 1800s, African Americans had to dress based on their station. That might be true for all people of color. You couldn't dress like the master or the master's wife if you were free.
Right.
And so this freedom to dress the way that people want to dress is so off-putting to people because they feel like they can't control it.
Mm,
And hair is huge. You met me, I believe, when I was still working for the state. I
mhm,
never wore my hair curly. I wore my hair straight
mhm.
because I didn't want to appear too ethnic while testifying in front of the legislature. And then I had a lot of power and authority, especially over white men in suits, I say. And
Mhm.
I needed to look a certain way just so they could hear me. I don't do that anymore. You're going to hear me simply because I'm talking with my hair curly or not. But the hair is a big deal. The dress is a big deal for a lot of people, even people from cultures from India, when they put the bracelets on the baby's arms.
Mhm.
I hear early childhood educators, well, that might be too tight. What will happen when they grow up? That might hurt someone if they accidentally bang their head. We need to stop policing bodies and really focus on positive interactions.
Yeah. Someone posted a minute ago, and I just want to comment on this, and then I'm going to ask you another question about, I can't remember the exact quote, but we were talking about family rituals and families, and they posted something about a family of people who hunted a lot and how important guns were to that family. And it made me think how easy it is to have a problem with guns, that you just have many of us have concerns about guns and how that could impact how we interact with a child whose family were hunters and who used guns. And it just made me think about how do we ask families? So we send home these silly things at the beginning of school year sometimes about, I don't mean silly, but things that aren't very useful at the beginning of the year. And I wonder what are the kinds of questions we could ask families that would help us get to know their child better so that we could do a better job of individualizing. Like when we think about family rituals, or what kinds of questions might it help us to ask families so that we could create a more culturally responsive classroom?
Uh, that is a perfect question because so many times at the beginning of the year, we send home these questionnaires.
Mhm,
And for many people, they're invasive and intrusive, and you haven't earned the right to
mhm,
ask. So the first thing is, again, going back to our pyramid model strategies, developing that relationship. And you can do that in the beginning when you ask a question, not an imposing question, but you ask a question like, tell me something your child loves.
mm,
What does your child love to do? Or thinking back as a family, what are some of the activities that bring you the most joy?
mm,
So you ask these questions in a way that elicits a wonderful response. Always positive, not name your child's three favorite things. No, I want to do that. But
what makes your child special? What's something special you want me to know about your child?
so I think asking those questions, building the relationship. During story time today, we read this book about a hijab,
Mhm,
Proudest Blue. We read the Proudest Blue about a hijab, and Caroline told me that her cousin wears a hijab.
mhm,
I'd love to know more and any resources you could bring into the classroom, anything so that Caroline will be able to see her cousin in our
mhm,
classroom. Those kinds of things. We're going to be having celebrations called Festivals of the Light. That's what I used to do around Christmas time because almost all winter holidays are connected to candles and light. And we want to make sure everybody is reflected. Tell me what you think of that. Really important. I think that's a great idea because Hanukkah ever comes up. My
mhm.
religion never comes up. I am so glad I asked. Will you think about ways I can incorporate that in the classroom and some of your traditions? If you'd like to come in and teach, just think about ways that we can honor you and your family and teach other children about it. Pretty organic in that way.
I asked my students at the beginning of class this past semester, at the first week of class, I think second week, I said, I want you to answer this question. What's one thing you wish I knew about you as your instructor? What's one thing you wish I knew about you that would help me understand as we go through this semester?
Mhm.
And the answers I got were incredible, and it really helped me understand where a lot of students were coming from. And people even wrote on the evaluation that was the most meaningful thing that a professor has ever done. So I wonder if that's the kind of question we need to get better at asking people.
Absolutely. It's so powerful. A
Mhm.
teacher here in Denver, in Denver Public Schools, Kyle Swartz, she sent home an assignment for her children called I Wish My Teacher Knew.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I read something about that, and that's what gave me the
yeah.
idea.
Just imagine if we ask families
Mhm.
after we develop the relationship, what do you wish I knew about you or about
It
your
makes me
child?
think of our friend Walter Gilliam, who does work on suspension and expulsion, who always says, you'll help me get this right. I never saw a child when the family and teacher knew and liked each other get suspended. And I think when you know what that family's story is, you don't want to suspend or expel a child.
You don't. That was the most powerful observation that I believe Walter has ever shared, that he
Mhm,
has never, ever seen a suspension occur when the parent and teacher
mhm,
knew and liked each other. What's the power of that? Again, I'm going to keep bringing this back to our pyramid model practices that are evidence-based practices. We know the power of relationships.
Mhm.
That is the foundation for everything we do.
It all goes back to that.
It
It
does.
when there's a problem, it all goes back to that. When we're successful, it all goes back to that.
Always. And I'll tell you, we have to ask ourselves, what's the barrier to developing the relationships?
Mhm.
We are now, Mary Louise, more segregated in our country than we ever were before Brown versus Board of Education.
Mhm.
We do not interact with each other. We don't live near each other. And because of this, we don't know each other. And we as humans have a fear of the unknown. My white neighbors don't know what to do with me.
Mhm.
The only thing they know about me is what they've seen on TV. And
Mhm.
when I prove those stereotypes wrong, they're constantly trying to figure out what box I belong in.
Mhm.
Once we can really get to know people as humans, let go of all those boxes, then we can build the relationships. But we're afraid, and we see people as others, and then we can't interact with them.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
and I are friends, and we can ask each other anything. I mean, we've had times where we've called each other, this happened, what do you think? Did I say this right? All of you, everyone in this meeting right now, you need to develop authentic relationships and friendships with people who are different from you so that you can ask these questions.
Mhm.
So you can ask, because you may have a fear of Muslims that you never want to admit, or I don't know how to talk to a woman who wears a hijab.
Mhm.
This happens. And because I don't know how to talk to a woman who wears a hijab, I'll avoid interacting with her. And because I avoid interacting with her, I won't get
I
to
make
know her.
assumptions about her too.
Absolutely. I had a little girl in the classroom. She wore a hijab. And I was observing my student. And she walked up to me and she goes, "Do you know what my favorite song is?" I said, "No, tell me." She snatched her hijab off and said, "I shake my hair back and forth. I shake my hair back and forth." Hilarious. And then
Mhm.
she put it back on. She goes, "That's my favorite song." But what was powerful is that a little boy, a little white guy standing near her said, "Ooh, your mom told you don't take off your hijab. You know you're not supposed to take off your hijab." Why was that the most powerful? First, what she did was powerful. And it
Mhm.
shocked me that she took it off. And can I be honest for a minute? It shocked me that she listened to popular music.
Mm.
What assumptions did I make
Mhm. Mhm.
that I didn't think this child would know that song?
Yeah.
See how I othered her? But what about that teacher that
Mm.
created an atmosphere where this little girl could be herself and
So
teach other children that that is called a hijab? It's
Mhm.
supposed to stay on her head and it doesn't make her any different. I don't know, it was something about that interaction that gave me an indication of the work that was done in that classroom that allowed every child to be honored, valued, and seen.
Okay, so I'm actually going to jump on that. So I want you to talk about, so you talk so eloquently about what we want to have happen in classrooms. And now I want to know how we support teachers to do this because I believe every teacher wants to see every child in their classroom succeed. And if they're not supporting some kids, I believe it's because they need support around that. We all do. I mean, I don't think this is just about teachers. That's just our conversation today. So I wonder, so we've done a good job, I think, as a field of raising people's awareness of bias. I think we learn every day about new acts of bias that we don't think of as acts of bias, all of that. We've raised people's concern and awareness about it, but I hear teachers a lot saying, "But what do I do about it? I don't realize I'm doing it. So what do I do about it?" So most of the people on this call are coaches or interested in coaching. So what do we say to coaches? How do you help teachers um, reflect on their use of culturally responsive practices? How do we help teachers recognize their biases and stop and wonder and reflect on those? It's kind of a big question, but I'd just like you to talk about what suggestions you have for coaches.
Thank you. First, coaches, recognize your own biases. Recognize that just like everyone else, you have them. So some of the work that you're doing is coming from a bias lens, because we have bias against those people we're supporting. There are some you think, oh gosh, she implements everything I tell her, or she's lazy, she's never going to do it, or she can't follow directions, or it's never going to get better. So be aware of your feelings and your biases. But secondly, as again, here I go. Are you guys going to get tired of me talking about pyramid model practices? Because we go right back to that foundation. Everything we say children need is exactly what adults need. You can take every pyramid model practice and apply it to adults and apply it to coaching, all of them. So the first thing that must happen in order to help people recognize their biases is to develop a supportive and trusting relationship. I have to be able to say to Mary Louise, who's my coach, without judgment, that kid gets on my nerves.
And there's a kid like that in every one of our classrooms. It just is.
Mine was Connor.
Mine was Laura, but by the way.
We have them. So when you have that relationship that's built on trust, the person you're supporting can be honest with you, then it opens the door for you to be honest with them because they know you're not going to judge. So this is where the agreements come in. And I'm not a specialist when it comes to coaching. I leave that to my friend Mary Louise. But I know that I believe you sit down and you decide on your goals, what those are. And then you have an agreement that I'm going to give you amazing, honest feedback. And I expect the same from you. So then you have an agreement. And I ask people, I ask my students, I ask my student teachers, tell me how you prefer feedback. That's really important. My husband, it almost always must be posed as a question. He was driving yesterday, made a wide left turn and almost hit a car. I didn't say anything. The next time he did the same thing. And instead of saying, why do you keep doing that? Not that kind of question. Why? You almost hit that car. No. I said, babe, I'm wondering if you're aware that when you're turning left, you sometimes get in the right lane. I don't know if you're aware of that because this truck is so big, but I've noticed, and I'm just wondering if you noticed. That gets him to respond positively to me every time. If I say, you're in that lane over there, that's not going to end well. So talk to people about how they respond to feedback. When you're given feedback, how is it given that allows you to respond very positively? And so that's one way. And then make a deal. I know that you really are concerned about implicit bias. You want to grow and be able to recognize when you're engaging in it. And I'm going to give you feedback anytime I see it. Is that okay? Yes, I want to grow. Easier said than done. You think you want to, but when you start getting that feedback, Rosemary, do you like little girls? Like, yeah, I do. Why are you asking? So you can be very sensitive. And then decide on a method. There are several methods that I use that I like. One is called ouch, oops. Some of you have used that. And because there are so many times you can't correct a person in the moment, but you want to give feedback in the moment. So if a person is interacting with a child and they say, you always do this, and you know that she has, based on the birds, you have information, this child is always in trouble, blah, 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 blah. And you want to point this out because it's you always, it gives no room for growth. And you might just say, ouch. And the person said, oops. That's how you handle it. And the other is, so let's say ouch, oops. And then let's talk about how that works. So earlier, I'm looking at the chat box and someone said dreadlocks.
I did.
You said that. So if we were in a classroom, I would say to Mary Louise, ouch. And then she'd wonder, like, what did I say? What did I do? And she'll say, oops. And her oops tells me that she understands something happened that we need to address later. That's one way. Now, had I gone through the chat box more carefully and I would have seen that, I would have used that as an example within this environment only because I have a positive relationship with Mary Louise and we already have an agreement to help each other to grow. Dreadlocks are a name that's given to the hair because they were thought to be dreadful. And again, we're reclaiming what we call ourselves and how we do. So we call them locks. My husband, my son calls them his locks. So we're dropping dreadful. But one of the ways that you give feedback is in a way that helps people to grow and want to do better. Some of you have been in my training, and you know, when I train, when I talk about these things, there's no blame, no shame. I base the way that I train on brain science. And we know about the amygdala, and when it's triggered, people go to fight, flight, freeze, or fear, and they don't hear anything because all of your energy is being used to survive. And once you trigger the amygdala, nothing else makes sense. So I'm very careful to do what my grandmother said, speak the truth in love so that the amygdala is not triggered. And Mary Louise is sitting there thinking, I didn't know that. I didn't know. And I know for a fact that she won't use it again. And that's what we do. And that's, Mary Louise, that's how we help to coach.
How do we build that kind of relationship? Like, I 100% know that you're still going to love me tomorrow, regardless of the mistake I make today. And how do we create that in a coaching relationship? I mean, like I think about all the time how we talk about coaching should be a safe space. And so I think that coaching issues should be between a coach and a teacher, not between a coach and a teacher and an administrator. But what are some other ways that we can create a relationship where the teacher feels as safe being called out as I felt when you did that or when you said something?
The best way is to be vulnerable. Let's take this off. Let's take it off. You do not have to be the all-knowing coach, imparting knowledge. Be vulnerable. You just heard, listen, Mary Louise and I are pretty visible in this town, in this field. All of you have heard us say, we had that child who got on our nerves. What other major researcher will sit here and say mine was Connor and Mary Louise's was Laura? That vulnerability, Mary Louise, allows other people to be vulnerable. When I know you're not going to use my stuff against me, then you can trust me not to use yours against you. I remember I was on a call and I was telling someone, I said, you know, I have this, what do you call it? Imposter syndrome. I did some work for a major organization and I wasn't sure if they really wanted all of what I gave them. And I thought, am I capable to do this? And I'm going through it. And the lady goes, Rosemary Allen, you have imposter syndrome? Of course I do. Can I be honest with all of you on the call? Before I knew Mary Louise Himmeter, I cited her in my work. I studied her. She was everything up here for me. When I started interacting with her, I was afraid of making a mistake. Like, she knows all about pyramid. What if I say something wrong? I went through all of that. And now in a matter of 5, 6 years, we have become great friends. I am not afraid of making a mistake because she's vulnerable with me and I'm vulnerable with her. So that's where it starts, the vulnerability. And then the practice. When someone tells you something, and even when you have that moment, to not disclose it, not to the supervisor,
Yes.
and that trust that this is just between us. I'll give you an example. We had a crier. We were in the infant room. This baby cried. It turned out he was allergic to his formula and in pain. But I walked out of my office and infant teacher, who was the only one on duty at that time because we only had 3 babies, was outside of the classroom. She was outside of the classroom with her back to the door. Talk about a, and I said, "Are you okay?" She goes, "No, I'm not."
Mm.
I said, "Tell me how I can help." She said, "I can't stand to look at him.
Mm.
Now I understand child abuse and how it happens." I said, "Thank you. Thank you for stepping out.
Mhm.
You go for a walk on campus as long as you need, and I'll be in here with the babies." I think she was gone 3 hours. I stayed 3 hours, and she came back, and she said, "Am I fired?"
Mm.
I said, "Absolutely not. You did the best thing
Mhm.
for him and for you. I only have one little suggestion." She goes, "What is it?" I said, "Can you call me next time? Call me before you step out because we can't leave babies unsupervised." That's it. That's all. We
Mhm.
never had that conversation again. But can you imagine the trust that was developed?
Mhm. Mhm.
Not only did I understand what she was going through, I didn't judge her because truly, even when she said, "This is how child abuse happens," that, are you kidding me? But isn't it true? Doesn't research tell
Yeah.
us?
Mhm.
That's it. She knew she was at the end of her rope, and she didn't get fired. She didn't get reprimanded. She didn't get written up. And our relationship was closer than ever. And she was able to call me when she was in trouble. That's
Mhm.
what coaches do. I'm in trouble. I need help. I look at this kid, one of my students, we go on field trips, when we were going to the mosque, she said, "I'm terrified because in my heart and in my brain, Muslims are terrorists, and I'm
Oh.
not comfortable going in here." The trust for her to tell me that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
she said, "Do I have to go?" And I said, "No, but you won't pass the class." "But I'll go with you, and I'll hold your hand and I'll sit by you." And of course, she was okay. So that's what we do. Everything you teach, but we have to be more honest with ourselves and
Mhm.
share things about ourselves that we may not be proud of so that people can see, okay, if you did it and you're here, then there's hope for me too.
So I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to give you time to say some parting words. But I want to say one thing, which is, as you were telling that story, it makes me think how important it is from the bottom to the top that everybody's committed to equity, that everybody's committed to being culturally responsive, because coaches can help teachers, but only if coaches feel like they have the support of administrators to call a teacher out about an issue related to bias, but not in a way that gets that teacher in trouble, right? And that they can keep it between them and the teacher, right? It just makes me realize that to make it work, everybody in the program's got to commit to it, right? It can't just be a coach and a teacher committing to it. It has to be the program too. So, having said that, we have just a couple of minutes, and I just wanted, I know, can you believe it, right? I can't even. I want to give you just like the last few minutes. If there was something that you wanted to talk about that we missed, or if there was like one parting message you wanted to give people, what would it be?
I really want everyone to develop what I call a treasure chest of
Mm.
responses. We all have a responsibility to disrupt harmful interactions. Oops, ouch, calling people in works really well, but there are times when actual harm is being done. And how do you stop that in the moment and also help the victim feel supported?
What do
So
you mean harm is being done? Sorry.
when, for instance, a child is being reprimanded in a very negative way,
Mm, okay.
in someone's in their face, "I told you, you're not going to do this. Do you understand me?" Blah blah blah. How do you disrupt that? How do you disrupt a child who says, "I'm not going to play with you because I don't like brown people"?
Mhm,
How do you like it? "I don't like the way your skin smells," because people have different scents. How do
mhm.
you stop that in the moment? Because that has happened to all of us, and we had no idea what to say, and then the moment passes. So the treasure chest of responses allows you to disrupt it in the moment. I wonder why you would say something like that.
Mhm.
That doesn't help people feel safe here.
Mm.
I don't think that's funny. Mary Louise, I don't think you meant to be hurtful when you said that.
Mhm.
That gives you a chance to say, oh, no, I didn't. But those responses neutralizes that speaker at the moment.
So it's almost like phrases you might use,
It's
right?
phrases.
Mhm.
It's a treasure chest of phrases that will work in almost any situation.
Mhm.
I was at the supermarket and there was a Mexican guy behind me and he had a $50 bill and the cashier kept holding it up, marking it, just going through all these shenanigans. And I felt that was a harmful situation.
Mhm.
And I said, I'm wondering why you're doing that. She goes, oh, we have to check to make sure it's counterfeit. And I said, but you've already checked. When you use your marker, that tells you if it is or not. I'm just wondering why you're still holding that to the light and double checking and triple checking.
Mhm.
That's our policy. And I said, well, you've never done it to me. And the guy goes, it's okay. It happens all the time. But just in that moment, to disrupt it, let her think
Mhm.
about what she was doing, but also provide the support to this guy because every now and then we need a person who's being microaggressed is rarely in a position to respond,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know. So anyway, that would be my
I love
takeaway.
that idea. We often think about what are phrases we can use to give positive feedback to kids, to ask hard questions, whatever. And that's good practice for people, right? That's something a coach and a teacher could think about together. What are some of those phrases we could use to disrupt
Yeah,
potentially harmful
think
interactions?
about Mary Louise, all the times you were in a situation and you went back home or in your seat and you said, oh man, I wish I would have said that.
Mhm.
So to all of you, the minute you say, I wish I would have said that, write it down.
Yeah.
Start putting that treasure chest together, practice it. Now, I'm a soft spoken person. And so there are some things that won't work for me, but some of you may be very more direct and it'll work better for you.
Mhm. Mhm.
So practice those statements and as a coach and as the person being supported, talk about them, what works, what doesn't. And just like you said, they can transfer to almost any situation.
Mhm. I love that. Well, Rosemary, we're so out of time. Victor's
Yeah,
probably
we're
about
getting
to
there.
about to whatever. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been so great. And could we just do it for 2 hours next time?
I know next time. Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for both of you for your wonderful insights and this presentation. Just want to let you know that your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey.